As you can see, this was modeled by Jamie Hamill Smith. It's a 3-cylinder naked street bike. You can find it here on Sketchfab, link in the description. I deeply appreciate the work that you did on putting this together. It's a beautiful model, and I look forward to doing the work and getting it ready for Unreal use. Don't forget to check out his content and other models he has available. One of the main reasons why I am utilizing this model in particular is because it has a functioning suspension in the front. If we look at this chain here and go all the way in, most 3D models don't have it go all the way around. But if we look closely, you can see that there's actually an inner sprocket, which you never find in most other 3D models. They usually model about 90% of the chain going around, and that's it. As you can see here, it has a good looking suspension spring setup guided by the swing arm. So we'll definitely be taking a look at how we can make that work for the complex setup in our Blender file. So let's go ahead and get started. As you can see here, this model is made up of several different pieces. We have the body, chain, front wheel, handlebars, lower fork, rear wheel, shock linkage parts, the spring, suspension, swing arm, and wires front or rear. As you can see, I can spin the rear wheel on its proper axis, but if I spin this front one, which is offset, it doesn't look correct. So what I'm going to do is first try to set its origin to the object itself. And should that not work, there are other ways you can get a centralized spin from your object. You could go into edit mode and highlight a very specific piece that the wheel should be aligned with. In my case, I tried to select the bar here, but there are extra components that kind of throw that off. So it turned out to be easier to select the two key points on the left or right side via the lower fork section. Shift S cursor to selected, and then going to object, set origin to 3D cursor. So the main point is that when your bike is ready for prep towards exporting to Unreal, you'll normally go through a set of phases in order to get certain origins correct. So yeah, now we see that the wheel is spinning properly. It looks pretty good. I'm looking for any slight offsets. I have a certain level of tolerance I'm willing to let go. And now we're ready to move on. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the scene tab and set the unit scale to 0.01, which, and somehow I joined this cube along with my body mesh. So I'm going to get rid of that. All right. And next, I imported the SK mannequin from Unreal Engine 5 and importing it into Blender. Should you have your unit scale correct, then it should import at the same size it would be in Unreal, and then you're just scaling your meshes up or down in relation to the character size. As you can see here, my character is slightly smaller than the bike, so I'll have to scale it down a little bit. So I just need to deselect the mannequin and then scale the bike down. I'll scale it down a bit by 0.65. That seems like a reasonable size, I guess. I probably could have gotten away with 0.6, but I think this is all right. And I'm just going to take a quick look around. Seems okay. Yeah, I'm pleased with this. So next I'll hide the mannequin and anything else related to it. So all we have left is our bike. Just do a quick check of the wheels spinning after scaling them down, and their origins are still spinning on the proper axis as expected. I'm going to select the wheel, lower fork, and the handlebars. Next, I can focus on setting the fork to rotate at a very specific angle so that when we snap it back into its original position, it will rotate the standard way handlebars do. So what I've learned is that you have to rotate them in an upright angle, which means that you'll have to keep track of the numerical value, which you can see in the upper left corner. And what you'll do is once you've applied your rotation, then you would basically rotate minus whatever it is you added, and you should then have a altered Z rotation, which accommodates the angle of the handlebars. So just keep in mind that you're just trying to get the handlebars prior to setting their rotation in the most upright fashion as possible. Performing a few left and right rotations, whether it be just the wheel, lower fork, or handlebars on their own, or all together. And as you can see, they rotate beautifully together. The lower fork sits at the correct Z angle, which will help support not only how the handlebars turn from left to right, but also when we want to apply the suspension up and downward, we will maintain this specific angle. And a quick test of the suspension in the front. And I am very pleased with this. So let's move on to the next step. So I'm going to hide the wheel, lower fork, handlebars, body, chain, and now we can focus on the swing arm and rear suspension shock section of the bike. We can see that the wheel pivot point Z axis is not facing the right direction, but it's rotating properly. If we look at the swing arm, it is under the same circumstances. It rotates properly, but the Z pivot point is facing forward. What this particular area comes down to is setting up correct pivot point for each portion of the rear suspension. So depending on which piece we're looking at, it's very similar to having the parent-child relationship between your bone in your armature setups. We're basically trying to figure out how the lower pivot point of one piece will affect the lower pivot point of the piece above it. And so the reason why this is so important is because when we go into Unreal and we're telling the modified bone node how it needs to move in relation to the previous bone that's control it, then we'll have a good reference as far as all of the pivot points being correct so that they move together in a way that is correct in terms of proper rotation. There were certain parts where I had a tough time trying to figure this out. And a lot of that has to do with me setting the rear suspension up on the fly without looking at any reference material as far as how the suspension would function. But if you actually look at it long enough, you can kind of get an idea on which parts move other parts based on their Z location. It's not really hard, but you still want to kind of ensure that you're heading in the right direction. I'm basically just taking a look at what pieces I have available and checking where their pivot points are located, and then trying to determine how this is all going to work in the final product. For instance, this upper portion of the cylinder, the rotation is fairly correct, and it appears as though the only piece that was correctly angled was the Z rotation angle of the lower suspension part. So for the shock linkage 1, we see that I'm selecting the inner portion of the lowest cylinder, and I'm basing the origin off of that. So that will be its pivot point. So I'll go ahead and hide this rear wheel as well. And now I'm focusing on the upper suspension portion and just deselecting parts that I don't think will make for a good circle region. I kind of ran into a problem here where it was hard to tell the ring portion of this setup. So I decided to go in edit mode and select both of the nuts on either side and finding the center origin between those two, because it has more to do with the rotation axis between them, which I figured was a good pivot point for the upper suspension part. Have your scene set up in local rotation so that when we apply our rotations later, they'll fall into the proper category. Utilizing global rotation will mess things up a bit, but keeping it in local will just allow for you to move things based on the object's origin rather than the global. So I'm going to select all of these shock absorber parts and rotate them in an upright fashion till I can find the best rotation angle. For me, that is 105.28. And then I'm going to apply rotation. Once applied, I will rotate minus 105.28, so the opposite of what we previously entered, which should put it back in its original position. I'd say that looks pretty good. So I'm going to hide the spring for a sec and select the lower shock absorber section, and I'm going to select the pieces of the base. Shift S and cursor to selected. Go back out of edit mode, unhide the spring, and then we will set the object origin to the 3D cursor. Great. And we'll repeat the same process that we did for setting up the shock absorber. I'm going to go ahead and rotate the spring yet again by 105.28. We'll add an armature. I'm going to go into the armature settings, and under viewport display, I'm going to set it to in front so we can actually see it. Then I'm going to select grid snap, E, and grab on the Z axis to pull a piece down so that I can maintain the origin without having to make any changes. And then I'll select the newly extruded bone and Alt F to flip, which will make that our root bone. And then we can grab the tip of the second bone and just grab on the Z axis all the way up to about the base of the spring. I'm going to try and line it up as best I can. Doesn't have to be perfect. And then one more extrusion upward, a few notches. I went about 3. And then we will select the bone in between our top and bottom, subdivide. In this case, I decided to subdivide it 4 times. Next, we will take a look at the bone names here, and I always set mine for B underscore root of sorts. You can name it whatever you want, but it's so long as that it's very clear that is the root bone. Next, I just go down the list, and if we take a look at our other bones, they're kind of named out of order. So I'm just making a few changes to set it up to be bone 001 through 006. Next, we will go through each bone and disconnect them all the way to our root bone. And the main point is that the root bone and bone 006 are essentially anchor points, so that while the root bone moves everything, the top 006 acts as a top anchor point so that you can move bones 001 through 005 without overly stretching or moving too much. Great. So let's go ahead and go into pose mode and do a quick grab test of each of these bones to make sure they are indeed disconnected, but still moving previous bones within the hierarchy. And now we can select the spring and our armature, followed by Control P to parent with automatic weights. And select the armature, go back into pose mode and do just a quick grab test, see how everything is moving. Fantastic. And that's what we want. So now I can rotate minus 105.28 to put it back in its original rotation. The armature origin is set. The spring origin was already set. So there's really no need to apply the rotation here since everything is looking good. And if I were to go to pose mode and move any one of these, you can see that it squashes in the way that we want, which is the primary goal of why I started making this tutorial in the first place. Has a lot to do with the suspension overall rather than simply setting up a motorcycle to function on a basic level. So some work may need to be done. You can do a more complex armature setup with more than 4 subdivisions if you like. If you're looking for a little less movement in between each of the bones, I would consider that totally fine, so long as you have your anchor point just beyond where the spring begins and ends. So I'm happy with these results, and I'm just going to take a look at the pivot point for the top and bottom of our shock absorber. Both of those have their Z origins set at the angle that I would like. Linkage has its origin with the Z upright, X forward. Same thing with linkage number 2. Z is not 100% upright, so I'll have to apply that later. I'm gonna go ahead and give the armature a name, and you'll also notice that it's the only armature that we'll have within this setup. I'll go ahead and unhide everything. I already have our armature selected. I'm going to go ahead and select everything but the spring, which is parented to the armature, so there's no need to have that within our selection hierarchy. And I'm going to lastly shift select the body and Control P, object. Do a quick move test. And I'm going to go ahead and set the origin of this bike to the geometry and go ahead and apply the rotation and scale, which puts everything in the correct rotation setup. Go ahead and apply this for the additional parts of the model as well. So as you can see, I'm just going through each item and taking a look at what they have. And I just kind of determine whatever its upright would be based on that. Now, this part isn't a necessity, but I went ahead and selected the main parent of this mesh, which is the body, and just grabbed on the Z-axis and moved everything down to line it up with the line of the x-axis. It's not a necessity, but it's just something that I personally have always done with my vehicle exports, and this is me not swaying from that particular step. So just keep in mind, you don't have to move it down on the x-axis. It's not necessary at all. It's something I do from what I learned a long time ago. So I just kind of have a very set format on how I run my projects.